Okie dokie, we did it. I got us around 40, and figured we'd just get going from there. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's morning here in San Francisco, but for our guest today, it's not. It's evening. It's dinner time almost, basically, right? Like, what is it? 7? Like ish.
It's 6:15 here at the moment.
Yeah.
Our clocks haven't gone forward yet.
Oh, right. Oh, that's so fun. It's just, I'm so glad.
Yeah, as if scheduling meetings wasn't hard enough anyway. When there's a difference in the time difference, it's even more fun.
So it's not just frustratingly difficult to understand what time it is, but it's also smack dab in the middle of dinner time for you. So I'm sorry. You're probably sitting here hungry. Let's get underway. Everybody, look, we got the people from WireMock. That's so cool. I'm a big fan. I've used your stuff. I mean, I don't know who hasn't used your stuff, I guess is the right way to put it. Yeah, just would you mind introducing yourselves so I don't butcher it? Who you are, what do you do, what you don't do.
After you, Tom.
Okay. So I'm Tom Akehurst. I created WireMock, and I continue to work on WireMock, both open source and also WireMock Cloud, which is our commercial offering, which builds on WireMock open source and gives you a ton of things that you might need as a team or a larger engineering organization as you kind of scale up your mock usage beyond just the kind of sort of unit test driven cases.
Cool. My name is Lee Turner. I'm part of the WireMock engineering team. I've been there for just over a year now, I think, working on both WireMock open source and WireMock Cloud.
Wow. Okay. So let's just start with absolute basic brass tacks, because again, I expect most people will already know this stuff, but for those who don't, what's WireMock? What is that? What does it do? Just the basics.
So I describe WireMock as an API mocking tool. So it allows you to simulate APIs that your app might depend on. So if your app is calling out to, say, Stripe's REST API, you can substitute the real Stripe API for a simulation that is running locally. One important distinction: so there are mocking tools like Mockito and so on like that, object mocking tools, where the mocking kind of happens, sort of in memory inside the code base, where bits of code are effectively substituted. The way WireMock works is to run an HTTP server, and then typically the app that you're testing will connect to that over the network loopback adapter, rather than sort of connecting over the internet or connecting into your cluster or something like that. So it's in many ways a sort of more realistic simulation of the real thing that you're connecting to. It allows you to test all of that code and all of that configuration and all the stuff needed in order to get from your application out to something on the network. So there's a whole set of testing that you can do that you can't really do with object mocking by adopting this technique.
Is there actually a faithful and up-to-date Stripe mock out there?
There are probably some. There's probably several, I think. We've
that alone is worth.
I think we have one in our library that we generated from their Open API spec. I'm ashamed to say I can't actually remember if we've got that one in the library or not. The Stripe API is very big. I mean, actually, it's what people quite often do is, rather than taking a kind of entire complete mock of an API, which might be a lot more of the API than they really need, right, they'll generally kind of selectively pick the parts that their code is using and mock those and just sort of emulate the behaviors that they need for their testing activities.
Yeah,
and sorry, carry
on. So to me, it sounds like this is a great way both to get speed, also to make mistakes where it doesn't literally cost you dollars and cents in the beginning, and to get sort of a proof of concept. And for your occasional integration test, you might switch it over to the real thing in like a dev mode. But for the bulk of it, in the same way that I want a mock for most of my testing, and then occasionally I want an integration test, I would choose WireMock. Is that?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, we'd never say don't do integration testing, but what we would say is use your integration testing for the things that you really need to use integration testing for. So to kind of uncover those risks that are, will only be uncovered when you're doing integrated testing.
for people watching who don't, I just realized Stripe is a payment processor. It allows you to you add them to your code, and then they'll handle charging credit cards and the like. And their API is famously super tedious and also expensive to use if you get it wrong, right? Like 1,000 different ways that thing can fail. So it's much better to get it right with a WireMock first than to go straight into that, you know?
Oh, yeah, great. Absolutely. Mocks are much faster typically than real APIs, both because they're running more locally and they're just simpler and cheaper, you know, to serve. So you're particularly when you're running big automated test suites, this can add up to enormous differences in build and runtime. Like I say, it means you get this kind of determinism that you don't always get when you're connected to somebody else's sandbox. When you're doing particularly kind of checking the sort of automated testing we do a lot of, then you want your dependencies to kind of behave in a deterministic way. And if they don't, then a test that passes one day might fail the next day. And that can be enormously sort of painful and detrimental to your team's productivity when that's happening.
Not to mention the hairline. It's just bad. I've got so little left. I hate inconsistent tests. We I think you know this, but for the audience, we on the Spring team, big fans of the old WireMock there. We use it in Spring Cloud Contract, which is, I don't know if that's the intended approach or not, but it certainly does work. It's such a beautiful mechanism. Basically, you write a contract. You write a contract, then you write your API. We validate that the API matches the contract, and if it does, then we're able to stand up a WireMock mock API for you that matches that API, right?
Yeah, it's a really great use case, actually. I mean, it's and that was one that was sort of developed wholly independently of us as well.
Yeah,
fertile project. I think found out about that when it had initially sort of been. I think it was pre it being adopted by the Spring framework, actually, when it was an independent project. It's always great to see these kind of use cases that you didn't originally build the product for, but actually it turns out to be a really good fit for, like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's again really good open source, really good technology. Of course, it's going to be a fertile ground for innovation, and that's just underscores what you're saying, which is, you know, getting an integration that you can trust and that you can reuse allows you incomparable benefit, right? Like especially in the world where you have lots of services. You know, we're moving. I see at the conference circuit and all that, I see people moving back to the monolith, but I don't think that's going to actually reduce the overall footprint of things with which I integrate, the collaborating objects of my network services. You know, like like Stripe. Even if I move back to a monolith, I'm still going to use Stripe, right? I'm still going to use, you know, network. I'm going to still use S3. I'm still going to use all these things that are hosted over the network. Heck, now we have MCP, these AI endpoints. Well, they're HTTP. You know, like I'm still going to want to mock that out rather than having to stand up those services each time. So it's just when you think you've compressed and reduced and pushed things back in the bottle, there's still 10 other things with which you need to integrate. You know.
No, this is absolutely true. I think the degree of interconnectedness of our systems nowadays is only getting greater and greater. I mean, I think actually the sort of reversion to monolith is maybe a slightly fashionable thing to talk about at the moment, but it's not actually borne out in what you see people doing. You know, I think most large organizations, I mean, I saw a stat the other day, it was something like 83% of organizations over 5,000 people are doing microservices in some shape or form. So I think they're kind of here to stay, even though they may not be, sort of quite this kind of flavor of the month as they used to be. And additionally, there's a lot of organizations who have these kind of partnership and supplier relationships, which are growing enormously as well. I mean, particularly sort of in financial services, you seem to have this very sort of heavy interconnectedness kind of beyond the boundaries of the organization, because there are all of these specialized services that you need in order to implement modern financial workflows, and you don't want to build them all in-house. You want to outsource them to someone who knows how to do just that one thing really well. So even if you build a monolith internally, you're probably still going to have a vast number of sort of external facing API integrations if you're in one of those types of business that is heavily interconnected in that way. So kind of travel and hospitality is another example of a type of business where there are sort of thousands of outbound API calls being made. You know, you get things like travel portals where they'll go and search sort of dozens of airlines and hotel providers and other kinds of providers all kind of in one go, and then aggregate the data back for you. So they have these problems particularly acutely when they're trying to test these things, because you don't really want to have to deal with hundreds and hundreds of third-party sandboxes that could be at any given time kind of slow, unreliable, wrong version of the code deployed, all of that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And that's an interesting thing. You mentioned the financial services thing. Obviously, there are consequences there when things go wrong. And so having the ability to say, we agree on this. This is the thing that is, you can consume this and we'll produce this as long as that is true. We're both happy, right? Having that ability to be very clear about that, I think is super useful, and
I guess another sort of benefit of using mocking that's probably worth calling out is that it actually extends the scope or the range of testing that you can do, practically speaking. When you're connecting to someone else's sandbox, even if it's a sort of complete replica of the real thing, making it produce particular kinds of response on demand can be quite difficult. If you want a kind of rare error case that will only happen based on some condition that you can't really generate on demand, then you can't really test against that very effectively. No. Even if something's trivial, is you just want to find out, is my system going to fall over if this API starts returning me 503 errors? And you usually can't call the provider up and say, can you start
failing,
can you go and pull the plug out on one of your servers, please, so we start getting errors back. It's hard to do that, but the benefit of mocking is it kind of has this sort of uniform cost to everything for whatever response you want to return. It's just as easy as the happy path ones.
Yes,
and it's not just mocking things that already exist. We kind of see a lot of people mocking APIs that don't yet exist, whether it's front end and back end teams or interdependencies between internal providers and external providers. I've worked on projects that interact with a lot of kind of UK government agencies, and they're notorious for just not providing implementations that actually mirror the spec. So when they don't exist at all, then you get some kind of bit of parallel development going on, which kind of makes a big difference.
That's a great point. I mean, so I just realized also OAuth, right? So we talk about, I'm just thinking of all the things that you're going to need in every service that you build, whether it's a monolith or not. So OAuth, maybe MCP, your S3. I mean, these are all things that are just, even no matter what you choose. And then if you choose microservices, if you choose service-to-service integrations, like you just said, if in the case of the travel portals or government integrations, it's going to be a hub and spoke at some point, right? You're going to have lots of integrations. And if you go into it eyes wide open, you can do really amazing things. But if you're sort of just surprised that there's network interactivity involved, you're going to have a bad time. And you just mentioned something really good, which is the idea of stubbing out a service that isn't there yet, right? We talk about, when we talk about the microservices discussion, where do you put the risk? Like if the risk in building services is in the actual business logic of that service, then of course you're incentivized to figure out that service and domain, and then the integration between other things, the outermost layer, the thing that talks to the other services, you can sort that out later. On the other hand, if the risk is in the integration, then you're incentivized to figure that out first, and then work inwards, right? Figure out the the external API, and then figure out the stuff inside. So what is that? What do we used to call that? It was like inside out versus outside in testing or something. I forget which is which, but like the idea is that you figure out what is the most risky part of the integration. And if you're doing it, in an object-oriented programming kind of scenario, same thing, right? Forget about network services. You talk about, I'm going to stub out these things. I'm going to figure out that integration first. I want to de-risk the interaction between my component model and my domain and the rest of the system. So you have these stubs, which stand in for the real thing, so you can de-risk it, right? Same idea here, I guess. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's true sort of down at the object level is true at the kind of the sort of network system level as well. That usually thinking about the design of an interface and thinking about what services a particular component should be providing, whether that component's a class or whether it's a microservice or whatever, tends to produce better outcomes than if you just go ahead and code and then kind of let the interface emerge from that.
Yeah.
And you see in big organizations, and particularly organizations that have got kind of legacy, or where the cost of change of the things sort of that provide for an API can be quite high. So the example I always like to use is inside a bank, where often you build APIs which are sort of stacked on top of generations and generations of legacy technology. There could be a mainframe behind there even. And if you want to add something to this, new to this API, because you've got consumers in your organization who want to build a feature, then you need to get that design right. And if you don't get the design right, then you run the risk of kind of having to do rework at layer and layer and layer down the stack. I mean, I have a friend who works in banking who was talking about a sort of 3-month cycle of rework that needed to happen in exactly this situation because of one field that they missed from the API design. So we kind of, I mean, this is kind of partly what WireMock Cloud is for, is this what we think of as a prototyping workflow. So right. Building a mock as a prototype of an API ahead of building the real thing. Not just because it unblocks the consuming teams, but also because it allows you to validate the design of that API really early in the process. You can take it within a few hours or a day or whatever, the start of everyone's sprint or iteration or whatever they're doing, and you can start building against it. And the people consuming it can then validate that this is really fit for purpose. This design actually incorporates everything they're going to need, versus waiting weeks or months or however long it takes to ship the first version of the real implementation of that API, to only have that oh crap moment where you realize that field's missing, or you realize that the way this data is structured is wrong, or something like that, and you have to kind of go back to the blueprint.
That's I mean, this is not a new idea, right? Mel Conway in the 1970s had seized upon the insight that software is a mirror image of the organizations that build it, and therefore, or the communication patterns of the organization that build it. And you've heard Richard Stallman. He said, if you have 4 different teams working on a compiler, you'll naturally have a 4-pass compiler. Basically, if your teams don't communicate well, then the boundaries between the software components that those teams create will reflect that lack of communication. And so the right thing, I think, is, since that's so hard to get right, is to do that first. Figure out that interaction first. And then a lot of times, this is the whole thrust of the microservices movement for people watching, was if that's the case, if the software teams not communicating correctly was the problem, then fix the teams and the software will better reflect what you're trying to do, right? Fix the communication between the teams and the organization. And I think having tools to make it so that talking to each other is really easy and cheap and fast and efficient, because nobody wants to sit there for long meetings and like, okay, I'm going to do this. Is that going to break you? Just that synchronization cost is the bottleneck that stops people from scaling. Having this tool, having something like this to make it so that it's just as quick as anything else you're doing in your own domain, in your own code bases. You can't put a price on that. It's literally why microservices are different from SOA. It's why we care about agility, not just
absolutely.
ROI.
Yeah, I mean I think the cost of changing things in between parts of your loosely coupled parts of your organization is a lot higher than the cost of fixing things within individual components. But I think as developers, we tend to maybe over focus on the things that are closest to us, so the things that are probably actually easier to change.
It's
and less so on the external things that actually matter. And I guess the other point about this as well is that validating things through use rather than kind of this is kind of the way I like to describe it, is validating through use versus validating through inspection. The traditional way of doing this, if you like, is to get everybody to sit in a room together, and you put something up on a whiteboard or a projector, and everybody kind of squints at it really hard and says, yeah, okay, I think this is the right design. And then they all walk away again. And I think a lot of people will have had this experience where you go back to your desk and you start writing some code, and almost immediately you go, oh, hang on, no, we completely missed this thing. Because the act of trying to use something sort of, I don't know, stimulates these thoughts and this kind of ideation about what you need, that sitting in a room away from the real work kind of just doesn't stimulate. So we see part of the value of this is kind of stimulating that discovery of where the risks are or the missing parts are kind of as early as possible.
Absolutely. No spec survives first contact with real world use. That's so cool. Okay, so fundamentally, all this big, I think I'm trying to connect this really small, simple thing to lots of big things, because I really believe there's I believe microservices, I believe modular monoliths, I believe consumer-driven contracts, I believe test-driven development, I believe cloud computing, I believe all these technologies serve to allow organizations to go faster, which is an existential thing. It's not just a better way to do technology. It's not just a new buzzword. It's actually money in people's pockets, right? In organizations' pockets. It's also peace at the workplace, right? If you have an idea of how you're supposed to get something done, you're going to move more quickly and you're not going to resent people. I think it's really, really important. So these big ideas, I tie them down to this project because I believe they have a direct connection to it. But fundamentally, what does it look like when people use WireMock? It's a jar. They can bring it in, and they literally just describe HTTP endpoints. I mean, in terms of HTTP verbs and so on, or what?
So we do actually have a couple of demos prepared that we can show. I mean, to sort of preface this at a high level, there's a few different ways you can use it. So you can import a WireMock as an ordinary Java dependency, and then you can describe using a Java DSL how you want your endpoints to look and so on like that. Or I tend to describe them in terms of stubs, taking from kind of object mocking terminology. There's a JSON format, so you can describe your stubs in that instead, and then you can have the Java process load it. You can also run it as a kind of standalone process, so you can download a sort of runnable version of the jar with everything bundled in that you can run on its own. You can run it in Docker. You can, and obviously, like I say, we have a cloud edition that if you want a hosted version of it, then you can run it there as well. So it's pretty flexible in that regard. And there's also a Spring integration, which is what we thought we might demonstrate if we get the opportunity today.
Yeah, I think we can do it. Let's do that towards the end, because I want to keep as much audio here for the podcast, and then we'll cut it out and do another video like in a minute, whatever, right after the podcast here. So let's talk about the cloud. What is that? I confess I'm a heathen. I didn't know about that part.
Sure. So we over the years we've kind of worked with people who need to use mocking at a sort of large organizational scale, and a lot of organizations have sort of tried to use WireMock in this context and have kind of encountered this sort of same set of scaling issues, I guess you'd call them, organizational issues, where you want to sort of start working on mocks more collaboratively rather than lots of individual teams kind of building nearly the same mock over and over again in their own code bases. You want to be able to bring in maybe sort of slightly less programmer-ish stakeholders into the mix, like sort of QA people. You want to be able to work with things in a way that's sort of dynamic and supports product demos and exploratory testing and so on like that. Sort of WireMock Cloud is kind of our way of taking all of those concerns and building a product that satisfies them. So as for organizations that want and need to use mocking kind of at scale in order to be able to maintain their flow and productivity, they've got sort of something they can kind of sort of an upgrade path from using the open source project.
So does it give me a way to centrally host these mocks? Is that the idea?
Yeah, so it's a SaaS product. Mocks are centrally hosted. There's the ability to collaborate on them. Obviously, there's a web UI you can edit through, which is a bit more friendly for sort of non-coders to use. There's
coders. That sounds really useful.
There's an interop with other formats is the other thing that we've gone big on. So the prototyping workflow makes really heavy use of Open API. So you can bring in Open API and kind of use that as a starting point and generate mocks from that. But then you can also go the other way. You can kind of prototype by building your mock, and we'll generate the Open API and generate some docs for you and that kind of thing. And then there's validation functionality in there as well. So one of the other really big problems that occurs when organizations kind of do this stuff at scale is that mocks and real APIs and specs kind of all drift out of sync with each other. Things change over time, and it can be difficult to kind of keep track of those changes and make sure that everything remains in sync. And it can be quite labor intensive, even when you've got the information to hand to know when you need to do it. So one of the things it helps do is you can validate your mocks and your real API and your traffic and so on like that through your open API spec. And so if the two of those deviate in any way, then you know about it immediately. You can break the build and then you can go and fix it. And obviously, so with the auto generation tooling in there as well, then a lot of those changes are easier to make than having to go in and hand change a piece of code.
I like
sort of every time it changes.
Sorry, I like the idea that you can work from the contract backwards, or work from the mock and get to the contract. Yeah, that's super good. Yeah. Wow. So let's say I work for Megacorp X, and I've got like 10 different federated services, and I know I can. Right now, the status quo is you end up passing around these jars that have mocks set up, and every team needs to pull in the duplicative set of jars, but you don't have one, if the team building API X actually evolves it to 1.2, all the different teams consuming that mock have to upgrade their mock to reflect the new 1.2 API if they're stuck on 1.1. This is nice because now I have a single, if it's not on the centrally hosted cloud thingy, what is it called? WireMock Cloud? Just
WireMock Cloud, yeah.
Okay, if it's not on there, then it's not real, right? Like I can say that. I can say this is the blessed one true version of our API, and everything else is, revoked. That's super good. I like that idea. What about I don't know. So am I uploading a spec to you, or what am I? I guess I'm uploading a spec. Is there like security? Like not security, like OAuth or whatever. I'm saying like, is there like you can't just like see the API, can you?
Well, I mean, you can if you want to, or you can secure it with OpenID Connect or HTTP Basic, or doing a match on a header. So it's kind of up to you how you want to do that.
And can WireMock Cloud see the spec and all that? Is it like encrypted, or is it like what if it's like the top secret level 5, James Bond or he'll have to kill you kind of API? And
luckily we haven't had to host too many of those.
Okay.
We have a sort of fully on-premise sort of Kubernetes-based edition that
Okay.
Companies who are really concerned with that kind of thing will tend to opt for that version of it.
That is
generally speaking, as long as there's some security on the front of it. We've got a SOC 2 compliance recently, which was loads of fun, and so a lot of customers are sort of happy enough that we're taking good care of their data.
Wait, what was the last? You said something compliance too?
So SOC 2, the security standard.
Yeah. Okay, that's amazing. So this is the kind of stuff that's not only better than the situation where I'm passing around. It's not just the same as me passing around the jar, but it's centrally hosted. It's actually better because the security stuff is where, that just becomes, hair-rendingly frustrating. Good on you. Well done. That's awesome. Oh wow. What does that? I mean, how much does that cost? What does that look like for if I'm just a startup trying to?
It's
cold world.
It's probably it's not something that I think most startups need to do quite as early as us. I think we've been quite unusual in that we sort of skipped the part where you sell to other startups who sort of don't mind about that kind of thing. We've gone sort of straight to the enterprise selling. And to the customers who really do care about that sort of thing. So we've probably done it earlier in our journey than you might. I mean, in some ways, when you're only a small team, it's easier to sort of implement the changes, but it does feel onerous in terms of the amount of work you end up doing that's not new feature development and so on like that. I mean, I think Lee probably bore more of the brunt of that than I did. So
it was painful. A lot of the SOC 2 stuff was painful, but like Tom said, we're a small team. We've got all the flexibility to make changes quickly and iterate around all these things. So ultimately, I guess it could have taken a lot longer than it did.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, I mean, ideally, I think one of the complications would have been having to deal with external APIs, but it seems like you've got that under control. So it figures you dog food it. Lee, what about you? What do you do? What's the good word? What are you up to?
I guess on the team at the moment, I don't know. Am I allowed to talk about these things? Or
of course, yeah, that's why we're here.
Cool. So at the moment, the team is largely working on new protocols. So I guess a lot of people think about WireMock in terms of REST API mocking. So at the back end of last year, we released gRPC into
we have a
WireMock Cloud, and
project.
obviously it was there in WireMock open source already. And we've been heavily working on a really smooth GraphQL mocking feature as well. So that's been post SOC 2, getting our hands dirty again and writing some code. Yeah, GraphQL, it's looking really nice at the moment, I have to say.
It's funny you should say that. These days I'm doing a very sort of roving, like my normal circuit talk is either one focused on AI and MCP, or one just my normal shtick, the roving, wandering tour, meandering through the wide and wonderful world of Springdom. And in that roving tour, I've got GraphQL, gRPC, Hypermedia, and REST, right? So, sounds like you just provided.
So it's interesting you should mention MCP, because the other thing we're working on at the moment is an MCP server. Very soon you'll be able to. So we've just shipped a CLI for WireMock Cloud. At the moment, it just acts as a kind of local recording proxy, so you can record stuff that's not on the internet somewhere. But the next feature that's going to come out is an MCP server, and the idea there is you can, particularly if you're using an AI sort of agent type thing, so like Cursor, I've been testing it with quite a lot. You can make these kind of really sweeping sort of composite changes to both your code base and the mocks that it supports. So you can do things like, say, take all of the APIs that this microservice project uses, generate mocks for them and publish them, and then rewire the dev settings in my project so that they use the mocks instead of the real APIs. And it will just kind of do that all off the back of one prompt. Or alternatively, you can say, build me a new feature, which needs a brand new API. It doesn't exist yet. Generate a prototype of the API, send it to WireMock Cloud, build the feature, wire the feature up to the new API. And again, certainly with Cursor, I've managed to get that all to sort of happen in essentially one shot. So this is kind of a really, there's a lot of potential in this, I think, in being able to really, get some of the sort of heavy lifting done for you by the AI.
Are you using Spring AI MCP to build your MCP server?
No, at the moment we're just using Anthropic's Kotlin, because all of us are written in Kotlin. So we're at the moment using Anthropic's own SDK. We'll see how we get on with that. It's early days at the moment, and we haven't really given any of them a sort of thorough kicking. So it might be that that we switch away from that one. It seems like the Anthropic library is maybe not getting as much. The Kotlin one isn't getting as much attention as some of their other SDKs. And I guess maybe if it turns out that they don't want to invest heavily in maintaining that, we might look elsewhere.
The official Java SDK was contributed by the Spring AI team. So
I didn't know that, actually. Okay.
Code in the MC Model Context Protocol.io Java SDK was from Spring AI. We extracted it out. It's now the official SDK for the whole world.
Okay, I didn't know that.
And we provide some extra niceties in Spring AI to auto-configure that, but it's completely usable as just a regular SDK without Spring. Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting. Because we're using Kotlin, I kind of thought, well, we'll use the Kotlin SDK, but perhaps the Java ones had more eyes and more polish.
Well, I don't know about that, but it works from Kotlin. So if that first one doesn't work, you can also use the Java one from Kotlin just as well as anything. Just objects after all.
Yeah, actually, come to think of it, I did spike the Java one briefly, and I couldn't get Cursor to handshake with it. I think that was
get what?
So when I tried to, I think I spiked just a very basic kind of, the sort of who am I endpoint, and tried to get it working just when I was going through and testing the available SDKs. And I think when Cursor was trying to handshake with it, when it first establishes the MCP connection, there was something about something happening in the handshake was causing an exception to me.
Did you disable the console logging? Is Cursor using standard I/O or HTTP? I guess that's a question. If it's using HTTP,
It was standard I/O based. I'm pretty certain it wasn't to do with console logging. I think it may have been something to do with serialization and overly strict serialization settings on one side or the other. From memory, maybe I need to go back to that and
we can talk
in a bit more detail.
Yeah, that's great. I mean and obviously the spec is changing quickly, which is again another reason why I would be using WireMock to insulate myself. To make sure I have cheap, easy access to that protocol, is because I can immunize myself against these fast changing things. Right? There's an RFC proposal on the GitHub for the model context protocol spec, basically, where they're providing a way to do resumable HTTP, because right now it's SSE, which is a service and events, which you create a long-lived socket. Once you're connected, it sends events to you. But if you disconnect, you start from the beginning again. You lose the ability to resume where you left off. They've just introduced like a token, in effect, like a cursor, like a.
Okay. Yeah. I think I know what you mean. That's useful to know. Yeah, I haven't looked at the SSE side of it very much so far. It seems like the standard I/O support is so much. It's so much broader, that there are lots of products, including Claude Desktop itself actually seems to only support standard I/O at the moment. So,
which is annoying because
like
I'm seeing from where I'm seeing it's HTTP, which is why I think about WireMock so much, because nobody's going to build I'm not going to connect my microservice to standard I/O. That's ridiculous, right? Most of us are going to use HTTP, which and there's even like the proposal, the MCP spec. There's even discussion around auth-z. What does that mean? OAuth, it means, right? So you can't do OAuth on standard I/O. That's not a thing, right? You can do OAuth with HTTP. And so they're only defining security for HTTP MCP, right? There's not even a discussion really of it in standard I/O. It's just sort of, you're on the same host and machine. Good luck,
Well, the thing we've been building, we have this problem because we want you to be able to interact with WireMock Cloud, and obviously you have to authenticate yourself against that.
Right.
So the way we solve that is that the MCP server is part of the CLI, and you log yourself in via the CLI, which then caches your credentials locally.
Right.
And then you connect the MCP server, and then it's just kind of using the credentials that you went and fetched when you did the login flow. But that seems like a bit of a workaround. And there should be something slightly more sort of native and intrinsic to it.
What I've seen is we've got one thing I ended up doing to solve that was I have an MCP standard I/O server that runs on my machine, which acts as a client, right? And obviously with Spring and GraalVM, it's easy to ship just a command line, a single statically linked self-contained native binary. I don't have to force people to download a JRE, so I can ship my mcp.exe or my mcp. Whatever for Mac and Linux, and then that server is actually just a client to an actual MCP service running an HTTP. Right? It's a little verbose, but now I have the best of both worlds. I can centrally host the actual meat and potatoes business logic that's important, and then for the Claude desktops and the other things that require that standard I/O integration, they can talk to the binary. And they can also do you can front load the authentication there, get a token, and then use that to talk to the HTTP service.
Yeah.
Both of which are possible with Spring AI MCP. And once you've got it sorted, you can mock it out with WireMock. That's super, super good.
Yeah, we probably need to put a bit of polish on SSE support before that's ready for the prime time. I should warn anybody that tries it out.
The spec's changing. It's not even I'm sure you've got it perfect. That's the thing. You're good engineers in the spec. If you've read the spec, there's not a lot. So I'm sure you've got a good thing already. It's AI. Is it Tuesday? Well, it's changed, Okay, so that's really, really cool. I can't wait to see this kind of stuff. So the idea that I could use MCP to sort of mold my mock services and all that is, oh my God, that's so cool. That is so cool.
One thing I was going to point out about this was one of the benefits of having. So how I mentioned earlier on that WireMock has both a sort of a JSON format as well as the sort of the code format for describing mocks. And I think I always had this sense that integrating via data was a good idea. That was one of the kind of very early design principles that I always tried to stick to with WireMock. But it sort of turned out to be kind of extra beneficial in the AI era because there's tons of examples of WireMock JSON floating around all over the internet. So there's lots of it's kind of made its way into the training data, which means that LLMs are already pretty good at generating WireMock JSON. You can ask it to generate a WireMock mock, which is a JSON file with a set of stubs in it, and it will usually do a pretty good job of it, and it will even do the kind of dynamic response templating, the sort of handlebars based stuff, and usually get that right as well. So you don't have to do much in the way of, in my experiments so far anyway, I haven't had to do much in the way of prompt engineering to get it to produce something good. There's a few kind of cues around preferences, really, where you're saying, I would always like you to have a content type header on responses if they're JSON, all that kind of thing. But you can get to that point pretty quickly and produce something good pretty quickly. I think in a way that if there wasn't a data format, or if it was kind of closed in some way, would have required a lot more work to achieve with LLMs as they stand at the moment.
That's a great point. I mean, yours, the WireMock configuration is all about describing APIs, and so it's got English prose in there. You've got very natural sort of descriptions and all that. And this, I cannot overstate just what you just said, which is like even Spring. We have found that because Spring is famously, since names are free, right? We're not losing real memory just by making our classes descriptive. We've benefited from that immensely. Our class names are descriptive. They're not just like these like people. The meme is the abstract singleton proxy factory bean, right? But I know exactly what that is, and you know who else does? The LLM. They don't have to read the Java docs.
Yeah.
Like we have very descriptive names, and so it's turned out to be amazing for generation and from an AI. You can get really good code. So I not only do I believe what you just said, but I can completely 100% agree with it.
Yeah, I mean, there's this interesting question about what the sort of long-term effect on framework and tooling innovation will be. I mean, I was reading something the other day, sort of speculating that LLMs are sort of locking in the dominance of the pre-existing tools and languages and frameworks and so on like that, because the sort of predominance of those things in the training data means that the LLMs are going to be better at producing them. They're going to be more likely to recommend them if someone's asking what they should use. And actually, the difficulty of getting something completely new sort of into circulation, above and beyond all of the difficulty of just kind of getting developer mindshare, is going to be people who are leaning heavily on AI coding assistants being able to get sort of good output.
Right. Well, good news is WireMock was already it was already locked in before 2023 or 2022 when the AI stuff came out. So you didn't have to convince me then. I was already using it in Spring Cloud Contract. I already knew, how valuable that was. Goodness, this project is old now. I come to think it must be 10 years old. When did you start it? Why?
2011.
Gee, yeah, okay. So why do that instead of becoming a rich handsome billionaire? Like, what was your why? Who does this to themselves? It's amazingly good tech, but I always wonder what the startup mentality is.
I mean, it was a side project, like most others. Really, it was a case of scratching by an itch. I was working on a big digital transformation, sort of pre-microservices for a large organization that was trying to do sort of a SOA modernization, but with REST. It was kind of a sort of proto microservices project, and it was just this horrendous mess. I was working on a team that was building an app that had to connect to everybody else's APIs, and none of them worked. None of them conformed to the specs. None of the test environments were stable.
Integration.
We were making no progress at all. And I went on paternity leave and spent a lot of time staring at a sleeping baby, and then eventually got the laptop out and started hacking away on WireMock. So it's kind of the twin to my first child.
Wait, so are you saying? Are you having? If I'm understanding correctly, you looked at your nascent, sleeping, beautiful babe and said, "I need to make the world a better place for this person to write software." The only way.
Yeah, let's go with that. Why not?
Yeah. It's more of a heroic thing, If they did a movie, Tom Cruise would play you, right?
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah. That's so good. That's so good. So 2011, and it existed as its own thing for again. For people watching, it's 2025, so 14 years, already. And if you watch this in 5 years from now, you'll be closer to 20 years. Wow. Wow. Okay. It existed as an open source project for how many years? And then when did you decide to do the cloud thing?
So I sort of started a kind of solo bootstrap company again as a bit of a side hustle back in 2017, and that kind of through a series of steps that are another story entirely, kind of morphed into moving the company over to the US, partnering up with Uri, who is our CEO. And who is based in the Bay Area as well, and kind of turning it into a sort of proper, venture capital backed company that can actually, actually has the capacity to really build the thing that our customers need.
Okay, that's super cool. I'm that, so often you see these like companies built around open source, and you want them to be a natural extension of the thing that made the open source so obviously valuable. And this feels like just that. There's a through line, like the logical final form of what I get, the utility I get out of WireMock feels like what you're selling, which is what I want. That's, if I like WireMock here, I'm definitely gonna like it down the road when I get to that state, and it's very clear. It's very like, do it, keep using the open source until here. And then there's a line and you can choose to cross it, but you're going to be better off with the cloud stuff, which I like.
Yeah, I mean that's what we're aiming for. I mean, I guess the kind of the way I like to describe the distinction is that that WireMock open source is about kind of inner loop development more than anything. I mean, not to say you can't use it in sort of outer loop kind of context, but its real strength is when you're doing test driven development or you're doing local development, live coding on your application, pre-commit, then that's where it really shines. And that cloud is really the sort of outer loop stuff. When you're dealing with interactions between teams and workflow, those kind of supporting workflows, like I mentioned earlier, that kind of deal with sort of the like multivariate change over time in your kind of API landscape, all that kind of thing that happens in larger organizations.
That's so cool. That's super good. Okay, so let's see. We are. I want to do the demo, so let's wind this conversation down. We'll end the stream and then start a new one in like a minute. But before we do, are you both on the internet? Do you want to be found? And if so, where can people find you and or the things on which you're working in whatever order you want?
So WireMock open source is at wiremock.org. WireMock cloud is in wiremock.io. You can go and check it out for free.
WireMock.io.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so good.
If you want to get hold of me personally, LinkedIn is probably the best way these days. So I'm just Tom Akehurst on LinkedIn. Fairly easy to find, and there should be links to that on our website as well. I'm on GitHub like everyone else, so you can. There we go. Yeah, you should be able to find everything else from there. Lee, do you want to? What's your? I don't actually know. What's your preference of being contacted personally these days?
Yeah, you can find me on most of the socials, but probably LinkedIn is probably the easiest. If you want to kind of head over to wiremock.org, in the top corner there's a link to our community Slack. You can probably find me and Tom in there kind of most days, helping people out if there's anything they need. So yeah, just come say hi.
Okay.
Yeah, good point about the Slack. I should have mentioned that.
Yeah, Slack is great for. I just love it because the nice thing about Slack is I can probably, I'm very lucky. Yeah, we get to talk, but everybody else can have that same good luck. They can talk to you as well and get from the source, so to speak. Completely superbly valuable. Thank you, gentlemen, for WireMock Cloud, and for the amazing conversation. I appreciate you. Appreciate what you're doing.
Well, thanks very much for having us, and it's great that we finally got to do this after what seems like months of bouncing emails around. So really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks.
Every single thing that was a bump in the road, I looked at it, I'm like, I'm committed to this. It doesn't seem like it's more valuable than this WireMock thing, but I couldn't just cancel it. And I'm sorry, it's just
it's the way life goes. I mean, I think I was supposed to contact you when I was in San Francisco, and I didn't. So it's not entirely on you.
Yeah. Well, anyway, this is really great. I really appreciate it. And like I said, okay, for people on the stream right now, just stay tuned. We're gonna kick off another one here in a minute or two. Is that okay with you all? Okay, and we're gonna actually look at some code here, which is purpose built for the YouTube. Okay, bye everybody. Bye.